Hello everyone, welcome. Today we are going to get started on an exciting new topic of developing RESTful web services using Spring Boot. These skills are very hot on the job market, so once you guys master these skills, your opportunities in the job market is simply going to skyrocket. So let's get started on this exciting topic. Today we're going to take a brief look at Spring Boot and get started with a very simple RESTful web service. So today we'll look at just review the basics of RESTful architecture and then do a simple demonstration. Before that, we'll also look at some of the motivations for Spring Boot by recapping its key features, and then we'll do an Eclipse demonstration followed by a Q&A. As always, please feel free to ask questions at any time during my presentation if you guys have any questions. All right, let's get started with the overview of a RESTful architecture. Remember, there are different kinds of clients, maybe mobile apps, web browsers, websites, or desktop applications. And we are going to respond to their request using a RESTful web service. And this RESTful web service is going to run inside a Tomcat web server, which is a typical Java architecture. Our clients will specifically generate requests and send it to our RESTful web service. And in response, our RESTful web service will generate a response payload containing some JSON or XML data that then the desktop web apps can use for their work. All right. Let's also look at the motivation for Spring Boot. Spring Boot is a Java framework that enables what's called RAD or Rapid Application Development. It has many advantages. The key one is it increases productivity and reduces the cost of development because it reduces the amount of boilerplate code that we'll have to develop and the amount of configuration that we need to do. In addition, Spring Boot is pretty powerful as it integrates with many frameworks, making it easy for us to interact with databases and perform persistence on databases and such, which we'll explore in this series. We are going to use Eclipse IDE for developing our Spring Boot application. To work with Eclipse, we need to install the Spring Tools plugin into Eclipse. It is pretty straightforward from Eclipse's marketplace. In the marketplace, simply search for Spring Boot and then you install Spring Boot and follow the default settings. It does take some time to download and complete the installation. And remember to restart Eclipse once the plugin is set up, and only then the plugin becomes usable in Eclipse. And before we develop our first web service, let's just have a mental model on what we are going to develop. We're going to create a simple web service which demonstrates the basics of working with Spring Boot, and we're going to use a software called Postman for testing it with RESTful requests. The functionality that we're going to implement is to just generate a number of seemingly random points to return a simple JSON. So basically, we are going to create a web service that we are going to interact with using Postman. So Postman is going to send a GET request to it, and the web service is going to send a simple JSON as a response. This request response is going to be handled by what's called a controller, which is a Spring Boot component that handles requests from web clients. All right, with all of that background, let's get started. I've already set up Eclipse and I've already installed the plugins for developing Spring Boot applications. So I'm going to create a project. Typically, we'll create Java projects in the past, but today we're going to start doing Spring projects or Spring Boot projects. And we're going to develop our projects with the basic starter template that we get. And I'm going to name my project Random Points for this demo purposes. And then we are going to develop a web application. So I'm going to go into the web options and enable Spring Web. And this is an extra dependency that helps us building RESTful web services. So you'll see that it's meant for building RESTful web services. And that's what we are going to use. And I'm going to click the Finish button. It does take some time for it to do all of the operations and set it up. And then once it's set up, you guys see a very characteristic structure of your project. We will explore these resources and files on a later date, but today we'll get started with the simple starting point application class, which contains the main method, the standard Java main method, which is going to launch the Spring application by calling a run method. This class becomes a Spring application through this annotation. So notice the Spring Boot application annotation that's been added. That annotation is the one that tells Spring Boot that this is the main class or the starting class that we want to run. For our application, we are going to add a controller. The controller starts off as a simple Java class. I'm going to call it like a random points controller, just to know that it's supposed to behave as a controller. The name of the class doesn't mean much. How does this become controller is when you add the REST controller annotation on top of this class. So by adding this annotation, you tell the Spring Boot framework this class should behave as a controller to process requests from a web client. And for this application, I'm just going to develop a simple a method that returns a bunch of points, maybe a couple of points. I'm going to call it get points, and this method is going to simply return a array of points. And for this point, let's just use the standard Java AWT point class to make life easier, built-in classes. So I'm going to return a bunch of points. I'm going to say new point, give it some x and y coordinates, 5, 7, another point with, I don't know, 10 and 13 as the x and y coordinate. Yeah. So this, just a couple of points, something very simple. So now how do we tell Spring Boot that we want to run this method when a user makes a request? And that's where we add the get method annotation that says if somebody wants to get or use the get to look for a resource, and what's the URL or path that we are looking for is just going to be a simple slash, that's the root URL. And once we add this annotation, we now know that, I'm sorry, this should be get map and not method, get mapping. And then once we add this annotation, once we map this path to the request, Spring Boot now knows whenever the user is looking for just slash or the default path, it should call this getPoint method and return whatever value it's going to return. Yeah. So let's see how this method now works by running this application. So we're going to go say run. Instead of running as a Java application, we're going to run it as a Spring Boot application. So here the program starts running inside Tomcat. Notice that Tomcat server is running on port 8080 for me, so that knowing that port becomes important. Then I'm going to switch over to Postman to send a request to my computer on localhost port 8080, and I'm going to do just the default slash, and I'm going to send it the request. And notice that it ran, it showed that it completed pretty quickly, and you see the response. Those are the points that we sent back. And ta-da, now you have your first RESTful web service that we implemented using Spring Boot. It's as simple as that. All right, that completes our basic demo. Let's do a quick recap of what we did in this demo. We looked at the basics of RESTful applications. Today we just looked at the GET request, but later on we'll see post, put, and delete requests as well. We use Spring Boot that eases development of RESTful services in Java. And later on we'll use more features of Spring Boot. To work with Spring Boot, we used the Eclipse plugin to streamline the process of developing RESTful services in Eclipse. And of course, we looked at some of the basic annotations today, like REST controller and get mapping. And later on, we'll learn about more annotations because that's how the Spring Boot works with annotations in your source code. Hope you guys found that demo useful and interesting. And now let's do some discussions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.